Where the Oranges Grow by Tom Moran. Roger hated the woman. It was that simple. Rocking in the weather-beaten chair, downing the last swallow of his lukewarm beer, Roger watched her. Not with a loving eye. No, his baby blues were burning, but it wasn't with anything resembling love. He watched her as a hawk might watch a chicken. It was the patient, determined gaze of a predator. Carla noticed that he was looking at her and gave him a big, goofy smile. She stood and waved. Not a quick wave either. She waved overzealously, spastically, like a child. Like a brain-damaged child. Roger forced a smile and waved back. Idiot, he muttered under his breath. Unaffected, she returned to tending to her little garden. Grove, he reminded himself. That's what he meant. God forbid he referred to the overgrown, weed-infested, unkempt, shit-ass cluster of dead trees as a garden again. The woman might have a breakdown. Narrowing his stare, Roger studied her and wondered when exactly his trophy had lost its luster. She was still a fine-looking woman. No use arguing that point. Legs to her armpits, the perky chest of a teenage girl, skin that felt like silk and smelt like jasmine. She had it all. Her hair, a fiery torch of orange that glowed like the lamp in a red light district. And the carpet matched the drapes, thank you very much. The sex? Well, you could use the word experience to describe her, but you'd have to spell it with triple X's. Carla removed her ridiculously large straw sun hat and wiped the rivulets of sweat from her forehead. Peeling off her t-shirt, she slung it over a dead tree branch. Underneath, she wore only a skimpy bikini top. A year ago, he would have been aroused. Dropping his hand to his lap, he gave his groin an indifferent flick. His penis stuck to his thigh like a hot, wet noodle. Nope, nobody home. So, when did it all crumble? When did it all come tumbling down like some precarious tower of blocks? Fishing a booger from his left nostril, he pondered the big question. If he had to guess, he'd say it was right around the moment that he set foot on the run-down, dilapidated farm. A plantation. That's what she had called it. He remembered it vividly. Beer in one hand, remote in the other, he was about to sit down to some Sunday football. Carla was on the internet. Carla and the internet was always a bad combination. Look, look, she called as she sprung from the cursed machine. Grabbing him by the arm, she dragged him from the ratty couch, across the sea of laundry, to the flimsy card table that supported the unit. Isn't it beautiful? Leaning closer to the tiny monitor, he strained to make out the details in the thumbnail. It depicted a small, newly renovated farmhouse, picturesquely framed by blossoming junipers. Maypop vines snaked up a white picket fence in the front yard, strangling it with vibrant lavender flowers. A red-tailed hawk, solemn and dignified, perched on the gabled roof. It comes with 100 acres of land, she gushed, and its own orange grove. It would be so romantic. He had covered his mouth to stifle a laugh. Their relationship had always been about as romantic as a letters page in a penthouse magazine. For crying out loud, their first date had ended with a sticky, no-nonsense interlude in the back of his Dodge Dart. Very romantic. We can't afford this, he stated with finality. Expecting the conversation to end, he turned back to his game. I can. She smiled, and it was the same I know something you don't know grin you would expect to see on a 5-year-old. And just like that, she had his attention. What does that mean? He listened, his mouth gaping like a hooked bass as she revealed her little secret. Carla had recently come into some money, $200,000 to be precise. It was inheritance money from a great aunt she had met only once in her life. Some people had all of the luck. Apparently, she had known about the sum for months, but had wanted to tell him until she was assured of his love. Roger nearly soiled his pants. Truth be told, he had been planning to leave her for weeks. He had come close to tearing up his meal ticket, burning it, and pissing on the ashes. Whew! Upon hearing this new information, he did the only thing a man in his position could do. He married her. It was an elegant, tearful affair. Held in the living room of their one-bedroom apartment, they decided to forego flowers for the understated flair of empty beer cans. Carla didn't wear a dress, but her trailer trash ensemble of second skin jeans and a day-glow pink halter top would have brought her mother to tears. Less than a month later, they were headed south to Carla's dream home. With the bed of his old blue Ford F-150 overflowing with their ratty belongings, they must have looked like New England version of Beverly Hillbillies. After an uneventful yet hellacious 2-day trip in the stifling August heat, they reached their new address. Well, it's not quite what it looked like in the photo, but it's still beautiful. He didn't speak. He could only stare uncomprehendingly at the ramshackle building. The paint was not chipping, it was peeling off in sheets. It was easier to count the panes of glass that were still present than to tally those shattered by vandals. The picket fence had been reduced to a pile of semi-rotted lumber. And the front door, well, it was completely gone. It was a veritable sight unseen shithole. "So, honey, what do you think?" she asked as she squeezed him tightly. Unable to tolerate her ignorance, he had shoved her away. That's when the honeymoon had ended. That was 2 months earlier. Since then, he'd been laboring from sunrise to sunset as he tried to bring the building into livable condition. Carla didn't seem to notice. Instead of helping, she spent all of her time trying to resurrect the groves and gardens. It infuriated him to see her happy and oblivious as she worked the soil and fertilized her field. While his flesh sizzled in the unforgiving Georgia sun, she stayed cool and in the umber of the orange trees. He tried to tell her that her efforts would prove fruitless. He had run into a couple of the local yokels in town. The toothless shitheels had kindly informed him that the land was barren. Nobody had succeeded in getting anything to grow on it for the last 4 decades. He had feigned interest as the men detailed a legend involving the Civil War, murdered slaves, and a secret burial pit. There was nothing like redneck legends. Whatever the reason, nothing Carla planted lived for long, and the orange trees remained unfruitful. She didn't seem the least deterred by her failure either. Instead, she doubled her efforts, cheerily exhausting remedy after remedy as she tried to bring life to the cursed plot. She was oblivious to how he felt. Ignorance was bliss, that's how the saying went, and ignorance was something Carla had in spades. With the sexual aspect of their relationship dead, they were two strangers living together with absolutely nothing in common. Two people essentially isolated from the rest of the world, forced to spend every minute with each other. And he was the only one who recognized it. Of course, love had never really been the reason for their union. It was a business decision, pure and simple. But he had been unsuccessful in his efforts to get Carla to put the money in both of their names. Only she could access the funds, meaning he couldn't drain the account and leave her high and dry. Actually, that wasn't completely true. There was one way for him to get his hands on the remaining loot. Although his contempt for her had begun to ossify into full-blown hatred, he hadn't reached the breaking point. Yet. Carla pulled off her soiled work gloves as she climbed the front steps. "I think that the pumpkins I planted are going to take." Her hair hung in unkempt clumps, and her face was a mask of grime. "We're out of beer," he said flatly, ignoring her statement. "I'll pick some up tomorrow. Right now I'm going to take a long bath and wash this dirt off." Roger's eye twitched as hot rage surged through his bloodstream. "Actually, you're going to run into town and you're going to pick me up a case of that watered-down piss they call beer. Then you're going to run it back to me before it gets warm." Carla opened her mouth, ready to retort, but she must have seen something in his eyes, violence perhaps, and she stopped. "Well, I do need some more fertilizer. I suppose that I could pick it up on the way." "Good girl," he dismissed her with a nod. She hesitated a moment, waited expectantly for a goodbye or see you later. She got neither. He blew into the top of his bottle as he watched her jog out of sight. Her feelings were hurt, but she would recover. It was like that little dog that returned to you no matter how many times you kicked it. A scream, sharp and shrill, cut through the fall calm. Pausing, he turned to the sound. It was Carla. Probably found one of those glass lizards. She hated reptiles. Likely, she hoped to set the bait for his attention. Well, he wasn't biting. The next scream was louder and even more urgent. Rolling his eyes, he stepped off the porch and set off in the direction of the groves. "This had better be good," he seethed under his breath. It was. Carla lay moaning beneath the semi-shade of an orange tree. She was holding her leg. What the hell is going? He saw only a flash of it as it slithered away from the scene of its crime. The impressive length of its slick, lithe body shimmered for an instant in the sun before disappearing into the brush. "A rattler," Carla wheezed. It was hiding beneath the manure bag. 2 bloodied holes on her lower thigh marked the bite. The area had already begun to swell. In that instant, Roger knew that his prayers had finally been answered. "It'll be all right," he assuaged. "Let's get you back to the house." "I need a doctor," she wheezed. Her face was paler than usual and glistening with beads of sweat. He ignored her. Scooping her up, he hustled her back to the house. "Here, just try to relax," he said as he laid her on the bed. "Roger, I can't feel my lips." Tears streaked her cheeks. "I need a doctor, now." "You need to sit still. I'll go to town and get the doctor." "But—" "No buts. The best thing you can do for a snake bite is to sit still and stay calm. It keeps the poison from spreading." He smoothed back her hair. It was coarse and oily. "I'll be back before you know it." "I'm so scared." Roger looked at the patch of purple forming around the wound. He choked back a gag. "Don't be. You'll be fine." Hustling from the room, he jogged down the front steps, got behind the wheel of the truck, and started her up. Peeling out of the dirt driveway, he headed toward town. "What are you drinking?" the bartender asked. "Make it whiskey," Roger said, "and keep 'em coming." Roger's stomach wrung itself in knots as he cruised back up the driveway. To the west, the last rays of the dying sun clung to the sky with red-streaked fingers. Hopping from the cab, he walked purposefully up to the bedroom. She lay motionlessly on the bed, and at first he thought she was dead. Her eyes were black and puffy like burnt marshmallows. Sweat darkened the sheets around her, and a pile of congealing vomit puddled in the pillow right next to her head. Her thigh was now swollen to grotesque proportions, and the dark patch of corrupted flesh had spread like a cancer. Only when he leaned in closer did he realize that she was still breathing. Her breath was quick and whispery, like that of a mouse. Confounded, he paced nervously across the splintery wood floor. His boot heels tapped a cadence-like tattoo, a beat for his symphony of panic. What if she recovered? How the hell would he explain his neglectful behavior? Carla stirred. She turned her head toward him. Her eyes were open, and as she leered at him, she smiled. Then she exhaled loudly, and it sounded like the air forced from a compressor. It would be her last breath. Then it was Roger's turn to smile. The sheriff didn't linger long. Tall and wispy, the elderly lawman exuded backwoods gullibility. He seemed to buy Roger's sob story completely. The hick even offered to have his wife come cook some dinners for Roger. Roger shook uncontrollably as he buried his face in his hands. He wasn't crying, no way. It was laughter that racked his body. Placing a withered hand on Roger's shoulder, the sheriff tried to comfort him. The body was zipped, tagged, and shipped off to the morgue inside the back of an antiquated ambulance. Singular red siren blaring, it churned up gravel as it sped into the night. No hurry, Roger thought. She isn't going anywhere. The mortician leered at him from across the desk. A plastic smile was plastered across his thin, pallid face. "I'm sorry, sir. It's the best that I can do. These things cost money, I'm afraid." Roger stared at the mock bill, felt his Irish temper rise again. Hot and potent. "I won't get the money that she left me for another month. Without it, I can't afford this." Bringing his skeletal digits to his face, he fingered a nostril. "Well, there is another way. And what might that be?" The small group huddled around the hole as a prematurely frigid October breeze tugged at their layered clothing. "I still don't think that this is a good idea," the sheriff warned for the umpteenth time. "This is bad ground, no place for a cemetery." "She would have wanted it this way," Roger explained as he wiped a forced tear from his eye. "She loved this garden, spent all of her time in it. I can think of no better place to lay her to rest." He failed to mention that he'd save over $1,000 by burying her on the farm. Apparently, these types of burials were still permissible in Harkes County, Georgia, and Roger was always a bargain hunter. Roger stared down the dark maw of the hole and wondered if Carla could see him from wherever she was. The undertaker, a large oafish fellow with a penchant for moonshine, waited with the shovel ready. He had dug the hole just inside the fenced-in garden, next to a pumpkin patch. Sadly, the mound of dirt smothered the creeping vines. It was the only thing Carla planted that grew. Now it would wither and die. Like an ebony scarecrow, the slender priest read from the good book as he delivered his brief and impersonal sermon. The only other person in attendance was an old hag Carla had befriended in town. The wrinkled crone eyed him suspiciously, angrily. Fuck her. If she suspected, she was the only one. The ceremony ended soon enough, and after a few tearful goodbyes, Roger was left alone at the makeshift graveyard. "Carla's field," he joked as he leaned against the flimsy wooden cross. Opening up a bottle of Jack Daniel's whiskey, he celebrated. "What do you want?" Roger asked as he stepped onto the porch. The resplendent noon sun jabbed into his hungover brain like an ice pick. The old crone stood, hunched over like a sack of potatoes. Wearing a ragged black shawl and thick cotton house dress, she looked overdressed for the climate. "I know what you did," she croaked, her one good tooth jutting from her dry lips like a yellow splinter. Roger stayed composed, despite the fact that he felt weak and unnerved in the old woman's presence. "And what exactly did I do?" Tilting her head to favor the eye not milky with cataracts, she ogled him smugly. "You killed her." He grinned. He couldn't help it. It was the type of reflex, nervous reaction one got when correctly accused of murder. "You know, some might consider that slander," he replied. "It's not slander, and you and I both know it." She grinned as her thick lips parted. Roger was reminded of a gutted fish. "More importantly, she knows it." Forcing a laugh, he said, "Honey, I don't want to hurt your feelings, but she don't know nothing. She's dead." Shifting her weight to lean on her gnarled walking stick, the crone shook her head. Did they tell you the story about this farm? Yeah, I heard all about the slaves. Oh, yes, she hissed. Jeremiah Miller. The Federals were sweeping through, and Jeremiah recognized the inevitable. He wasn't going to let no Yank part him in his property, so he killed his slaves, every last one of them. The field slaves he burned, just lit up in the ramshackle sheds that served as their living quarters. And as the house slaves slept, he crept quietly into their beds and slit their throats, one by one. Not all of the poor souls slept through the carnage. Some stragglers tried to escape from the slaughter. Jeremiah chased them down on horseback and shot them where they stood. Then he dug a pit and buried each and every one of them in his fields. God knows how long it must have taken him. At last count, he had over 24 hands. Well, Jeremiah was right, and the North did eventually come through. But when they arrived at the plantation, he was in no shape to answer for his crimes. Those poor fellows that found him said they had been ripped to shreds. They blamed it on wild animals, but his neighbors knew better. Let me guess, Roger interrupted. Those murdered slaves rose from the grave and did him in. Yes and no. You see, what Jeremiah didn't recognize is that his land was bad. Thin. Thin? Some places on Earth, the boundaries between our world and hell are weaker, thinner. Burying those poor souls was like planting seeds, but the crop it yielded was nothing of this world. What was it then? Although he wouldn't admit it, he was captivated by her tale. You'll find out, my boy, she laughed, and it was as abrasive as sandpaper. 'Cause you just planted seeds of your own. Her tale completed, the old crone turned away and began shuffling back down the driveway. You're full of shit, Roger called after her. We'll see, my boy, we'll see. What the hell? He stared at the grove, uncomprehendingly. The cultivated patch was no longer barren. Seemingly overnight, it had sprung to life. The orange trees, gnarled and nearly naked just the night before, were now vested in vibrant leaves. They looked ready to be able to bear fruit. Even the garden had been resurrected. The shriveled-up vines and stalks were now swathed in green. It was a veritable forest of color. Never had anything so beautiful gotten him so spooked. Roger wasn't a gardener by any stretch of the imagination. He was, however, pretty certain that plants couldn't just grow overnight. He remembered the old lady's parting words, "'Cause you just planted a seed of your own." Placing his beer down on the rail, he stepped off the porch and jogged to the garden. When he went to bed the night before, the plot was a bare patch of dirt. Carla's grave was now infested by pumpkin vines. Like the tentacles of some subterranean beast, they reached from the earth, snaking up her cheap grave marker and strangling the surrounding fence. Tiny green balls dangled from the stalks like Christmas ornaments. Apparently, poor Carla had a use after all. Her body made one hell of a fertilizer. Oh, Carla, if you could only see your garden now, he muttered to the tilted cross. Somewhere within the tangle of vegetation, something tittered. Unnerved, Roger retreated back to the safety that only his house and a case of beer could bring him. The twittering grew louder. Outside, a late October wind had begun to howl, but beneath the weather's bold orations was something else. The soft, high-pitched muttering of what? Roger had never heard anything like it. It almost reminded him of the chirpy communications of squirrels. But if it was squirrels, then there must have been hundreds of them out there. Maybe even thousands. Granted, the Georgian forests were new to him. Although he had been there a couple of months, he wasn't yet accustomed to some of the animals that lived there. Christ, the first time that he saw an animal skitter across the ceiling, he nearly shit his pants. Roger was starting to lose his nerve. Downing the last of his dinner, a pint of cheap whiskey, he stared out into the inky evening. Just guilt, he surmised. Fighting through the alcohol-induced haze clouding his brain, he concluded that the sounds were little more than paranoia. His guilty mind was transforming ordinary forest noises into something more hideous and foreboding. The old crone wasn't making it any easier for him either. Twice he had spotted her walking amongst the orange trees. However, each time he sprinted out to confront her, she had inexplicably vanished. He recognized the game she was playing. She was a living, breathing ghost, haunting him with the subtle reminders of his culpability. Just a couple more weeks in this backwoods town, and he'd be home free. But would he make it? At that moment, with the whispering garden growing louder with each moment, he wouldn't have bet on it. It was Halloween, All Hallows Eve, and Roger wasn't expecting any trick-or-treaters. Never know, maybe Ma's and Pa's all over the town would load all the little children into the back of the 50s model Chevy and go on a cross-country Halloween romp. He pictured the little hillbillies garbed in their uninspired homemade costumes, holding out soiled pillowcases. Trick or treat, they would yell through green teeth and chapped lips, and he would smile, pat their matted, greasy hair, and deposit a warm bottle of beer in each of their sacks. Daddy Hillbilly, appreciative of the gesture, would give Roger an enthusiastic thumbs up. He laughed hoarsely as he tossed his empty bottle off the porch. It landed in the expanding pile with a loud, silvery clink. The grove had calmed down the last couple days. The high-pitched mumblings were little more than whispers. The groves and garden were now a cornucopia of fruits and vegetables, with each and every plant producing an incredible yield. If he were a farmer, he would have been overjoyed. There would have been an extra thank you to God at the dinner table prayer. But he wasn't a farmer. The insidious, miraculously fast-growing produce had him frightened. "Damn it," he screamed as he staggered to his feet. It was Halloween and he should be celebrating. In less than 1 week, he would be handed a check for over $100,000. Then, the rubber would meet the road. Bracing himself against the doorway, he made his way to the bedroom. Tearing one of Carla's sundresses out of her dresser, he slipped it on over his clothes. It was ridiculously snug, but he kept it on. He complimented his ensemble with one of her gaudy straw sun hats. "Trick or treat," he screamed as he examined himself in the mirror. "Guess who I am?" He deepened his voice as he answered. "Let me see. Are you Carla?" Giggling maniacally, he answered, "Yes, sirree." Singing and dancing, Roger stumbled into the kitchen. Tearing through the drawers, he selected a large butcher knife. In the cabinet, he discovered a box of thick white candles. Perfect. Knife in hand, he stumbled outside and weaved toward the garden. A swollen moon hung low in the night sky. The countryside was bathed in an eerie blue. Cutting away the vines that pinched the gate shut, Roger entered the garden. The silence was oppressive, unnatural. Although there were no thunderstorms forecasted, the air was electric, alive. The tiny hairs on the back of his neck stood on end and tickled, stimulated by the breeze. Roger stalked to the pumpkin patch that infested his wife's gravesite. The giant orange forms seemed to glow fluorescent in the moonlight. There were pumpkins of all shapes and sizes. One of the gourds stood waist high. He selected a big one, a 20-pounder, and cut the vine holding it. Hefting it into his arms, he returned to the house. His arms burning from the weight, Roger set the pumpkin on the table. Can't have Halloween without a jack-o'-lantern. Taking another swing of his beer, he eyed the giant pumpkin as he prepared to gut it. Gripping the knife in both hands, he plunged it in. 2 things happened. Something warm, wet, and sticky spattered his face, and the pumpkin screamed. Dropping the knife, Roger brought his hands to his ears as he tried to block out the piercing shriek. It was hideous, with an unnatural, hellacious tone and pitch that deafened the ears and paralyzed the soul. Finally, the fiendish call subsided, and Roger took his hands from his ears and opened his eyes. "Oh, dear God," he muttered weakly as he realized what covered his hands and ran down his face in hot streams. Blood. Thick, bright red blood. The knife still jutted from the top of the pumpkin. Blood bubbled from a gaping hole in the side and puddled beneath it. If the blood wasn't fearsome enough, there was also the arm. The side of the pumpkin had cracked, much like an egg, leaving a jagged, gaping hole. Dangling from the moist, pulpy breech was a tiny arm. The appendage was dark red in color, and its stringy, highly defined composition reminded Roger of exposed muscle. It glistened with a mucoid sheen. On the tip of each of its tiny fingers was a curved black claw. Terrified, yet fascinated, Roger crept to the creature. He held his breath as he reached out and touched the hand. It was warm and slick. Roger gave it a little squeeze. Beneath the spongy flesh were tiny little bones. What the hell is this? His fear subsiding, he held the pumpkin with one hand as he pulled the knife free with another. Nobody would ever believe him. He needed evidence. Gripping the slimy limb, he put the blade of the knife against the shoulder and prepared to cut. Instantly, the arm grew turgid. "Shit!" Roger spat. Reaching out, the creature latched onto his finger with its tiny hand. Its nails dug deep into the meat of his finger, drawing blood. Screaming, Roger pulled his hand away. The arm twisted and spasmed violently. Roger didn't know what was going on, and at that moment, he didn't give a shit. Instantly sober, he knew that he had to get the hell away from the farm. Outside, the garden sounded off again. This time, the various mutterings and whisperings mingled together with one cacophonous voice. They were calling his name. Roger felt his bladder release as he sprinted for the front door. Clutching the knife, he peered out into the yard. Eyes moist, he looked across the driveway to the truck. Only a few yards separated him from escape. The grove was bustling with activity. Branches swayed and leaves rustled as if driven by a powerful wind, yet the night air was completely still. And the unholy murmurings had begun again. This time, they were more purposeful, angry. They proffered only damnation and pain. One cry rose above them all. It was coarse, semi-melodic, like the caw of a crow. Tears ran from his eyes as he made an awkward sprint toward the truck. He stumbled, landing face first in the dirt. Scrambling to his feet, he was about to continue when an ear-splitting scream sapped the energy from his limbs. It waited, just a few feet in front of him. Just over 4 feet high, the tiny humanoid stood, poised and ready to strike. His fibrous, lean muscles glistened, and moist strands of orange pulp festooned from its body. 2 long black horns, like those of a ram, spiraled out of the sides of its head. It grinned, and its mouth was lined with row upon row of spiny teeth. He knew what he was staring at, although it denied all logical explanation. It was a pumpkin man, and Roger didn't need an old crone to tell him that the thing had been delivered straight from hell. He understood now why the pumpkin had bled, and what the little arm had belonged to. The little beast was joined by 2 more of its freakish ilk. Chattering in foul, unknown tongues that echoed with the voices of many, they planned their attack. Roger clutched his knife. He was ready. The creature attacked, moving with a feline-like speed and efficiency. One leapt at his leg, bangs bared. Roger kicked it solidly in the chest, knocking it back against the trunk. It left a crimson smear as it slowly slumped to the ground. The largest latched onto his thigh with razor-like claws and bit in. Screaming in agony, Roger tried to shake it loose. Seeing an opening, the third pumpkin man scampered up a tree and jumped from a low-hanging bough onto Roger's head. Wrapping his face with its tiny arms and legs, it tried to suffocate him. Razor-sharp claws stabbed at his head and sliced his flesh. Blood ran down the nape of his neck in a warm, slick wave. Unable to see, Roger stabbed blindly at his leg. The creature caterwauled as the blade pierced its back. It relinquished its hold. Roger seized the one straddling his face with his free hand. It was wet and spongy like pumpkin guts. Peeling it free, he gasped for air. The beast flailed as it tried to free itself from his grip. Roger put the blade of the knife to its skinny throat and sawed its head off. Blood sluiced from the severed neck, spraying him with noxiously sweet-smelling fluid. For a moment, he was free. Wiping off his face with the back of his hand, Roger looked toward the truck. A horde of pumpkin men had climbed onto the vehicle to watch the battle. 24 of the demons filled the bed and covered the hood. Their nails dragged against the metal body, producing a high-pitched screech. Standing behind them was the leader. A full 5 feet tall, this beast had a shapely, more feminine figure. Long strands of reddish pulp hung from its head like tresses of hair. 2 gristly mounds jutted from where her chest should be. A pumpkin stem nipple capped off each breast. It was Carla, or at least a crude, vegetative representation of her. This was the commanding voice that had risen above the cacophony of the orchard with a godlike potency. The pumpkin Carla pointed at him with a gnarled finger. The tiny army commenced its attack. Dropping the knife, Roger turned and fled. He hurdled the short fence, heading heedlessly into the grove. The orange trees blocked out most of the moonlight, and the ground was smeared in dark shadow. As he fled deeper into the acreage, he tried to ignore the murderous battle cries of the pursuing army. Chancing a glance behind him, Roger didn't see the vines stretched across the path in front of him. Tripping over the line, he was pitched forward onto the ground. He was in a small clearing at the center of the grove. The redolent odor of citrus hung heavily in the crisp air. It was overpowering. Feeling the ground beneath him, he didn't find soil and grass. No, he was laying in a thick pile of orange rinds. Roger rolled over onto his back and looked around. The entire orchard floor was blanketed in empty orange peels. There must be thousands, he estimated. Above him, all of the trees were devoid of fruit. But where were the... His question was answered before it was finished. He could see them now, waiting patiently at the edge of darkness. Their hungry yellow eyes glowed like hanging stars in the night. Everything was abuzz with the soft clicking of hungry jaws as they snapped open and closed. Like a great tide, the orange men advanced. I'm dead, Roger thought as he scrambled away from the horde. His hand struck something long and hard beneath the orange peels. It was the handle of a shovel. God bless Carla and her sloppy tendencies. Kneeling on the embryonic sacks of his foes, Roger pulled the shovel free and gripped it tightly in his hands. Come and get it, he screamed in rage as he raised the makeshift weapon. Wild with the scent of their prey, the first wave closed in. Roger swung his weapon with all his strength. Dozens of the tiny freaks were smashed on impact. Yeah! He swept the shovel back and forth the other way, taking more of them out. He was reminded of days past when firecrackers and frogs made for lively entertainment. The demons exploded in a shower of twitching limbs and syrupy gore. Licking his lips, Roger found that the fetid fluid tastes of citrus and blood. A straggler, spared from the same grisly fate as the rest of his brigade, made a lunge for Roger's throat. Roger caught the creature in midair and crushed it in his hand. With the first wave decimated but others approaching, he decided it was time to make his escape. Springing to his feet, he sprinted away from the approaching army and toward the end of the grove. He wasn't sure what safety the surrounding wilderness proffered, but he'd take a rattler over a mob of angry demons any day. Behind him, growing softer and more distant, was the tiny patter of feet. He didn't know how long he had run blindly through the dense forest. Low-hanging limbs and webs of vines had torn his face with each step, and blood ran freely from several deep scratches. Twice he had fallen, once he had run into a tree and was nearly knocked unconscious, but still he persevered. It was with unparalleled relief that he discovered the dilapidated cabin in the clearing. If it weren't for the yellow flicker of candlelight that danced in the grimy window, he would have assumed the residence deserted. The covered porch looked ready to cave in, and all but one of the windows had been crudely boarded up. Smoke curled in a wispy spiral from the ancient crumbling stone chimney. It looked ready to teeter over in a shower of mortar and stone. On the opposite side of the home, a mammoth gnarled trunk of a massive oak grew into the roof. Stopping to vomit an acrid concoction of alcohol and chocolate, Roger wondered whom the shack belonged to. He stumbled up the rickety stairs and pushed open the plank door. The interior of the cabin was one large room, and it was in worse shape than the exterior. Thick, dust-covered cobwebs festooned from the rafters, hanging like cheap lace curtains. The home's furniture consisted of a ratty sofa and small wicker table. It was on the table that the candles had been placed. As he stepped inside, one of the floor planks crumpled beneath his weight. "Hello?" he yelled. "I knew that you'd make it," a voice called from a darkened corner. Roger recognized it as well as his own. "You!" The old crone seemed to materialize out of the shadows. Dressed in a thick hooded cape, she looked every bit the Wicked Witch. "They're after me. These things." "I know." She cut him off. "I tried to tell you, but you wouldn't listen." "Please, can you help me?" "Oh, I can help you. I can make them all go away." She shuffled closer, and he noticed that her feet were bare. Her talon-like toenails scraped the rotted wood floor. "But you need to help me first." Roger cringed. Was she trying to sound sultry? "Anything. What do you need?" A grin cut a jagged path across her face. In one smooth motion, she cast off her cape. "Oh, sweet shit," Roger moaned. She was naked. To Roger, she looked like a pale piece of human jerky. "What are you doing?" he asked. Perhaps he had misconstrued her advances. "You know what I want. Make love to me." Holding her leathery arms out, she beckoned for his embrace. "Come on, you've got to be kidding me." "Carla told me you make love like an animal. Now I want to feel it. It's been so long." Of all the people she had to brag to, Roger took a step back. "There must be another way." "I can make it good for you, too. I know things, and I have oils." And for just an instant, Roger considered the proposition. If he went back outside, those things would eventually run him down and kill him. However, if the old lady really could make them all go away, then maybe... Her aged breasts sagged to her waist like two deflated balloons. The overgrown patch of her silvery pubic hair, thick and lethal, glistened like a nest of barbed wire. No fucking way. "I'm sorry, but the answer's no." The crone wasn't listening. With a quick lunge, she launched herself at him. "Give it to me," she cackled as her hand grabbed at his chest and his groin. Her essence was jasmine and stale sweat. He shoved her away. "Get away from me, you crazy old witch." Stumbling backward, the old woman's legs gave out. She reached out with her flailing arms for something to break her fall. She found nothing. Her head struck the edge of the fireplace with a sickening crack. The crone slumped to the floor, her body twitching, blood bubbling from a gaping head wound. "Oh, God, no!" His nightmarish situation was growing more and more surreal by the minute. Realizing that there was little more that he could do to help her, Roger ran back outside. From just beyond the forest edge came a chorus of shrill cries. They had found him. The remnants of an old dirt driveway cut through the surrounding woods, and it was to this breach that Roger sprinted. The sounds of his pursuers reverberated through the still night. They seemed to come from every direction. Ahead, the path widened, and the backdrop of silhouetted trees gave way to a clear night sky. He had reached the road. Roger was not an athlete. As his muscles tightened and his chest throbbed, he recognized that his body had been pushed as far as it would go. Adrenaline could only be expected to carry him so far. With his steps faltering, he pushed on. Somehow, he knew intuitively that he would be safe if he could just reach the road. Exploding from the waist-high brush, Roger never saw the truck coming. He turned to the beeping horn, shielding his eyes from the headlights. "Are you awake, son?" Roger's first conscious realization was that his head was pounding. His second, he was alive. Slowly, he opened his eyes. He was in a car, a cop car to be precise. The sheriff sat next to him, his tall frame hunched over the steering wheel. You took quite a knock back there. You're lucky I saw you when I did, or you would have been nothing but a smear on the road. Instantly, the details of his current situation flooded his thoughts. The pumpkin people, Carla, the old crone. You have to help me, he screamed. They're after me. The sheriff gave him a fatherly pat on the leg. Now calm down. I know everything. Roger envisioned the grotesque monsters, born of pumpkin and orange and animated with the angered souls of the damned. How could he know? But you don't understand. The sheriff ignored him as he went on. They're spreading, making their way towards town. If we don't get this thing settled by daybreak, all hell will break loose. You've seen them? Roger asked. He didn't think the explanation would be so easy. Plucking a cigarette from the soft pack on the dash, he placed it between his thin, shriveled lips. I've seen them. So what are you going to do? I'm fixing to make things right. The sheriff slowed down and eased the car into a narrow dirt driveway. Shifting up, he spun clouds of dirt as he sped up the narrow lane. It was Roger's driveway. Hey, what the hell are you doing? He asked, panic thick in his throat. The sheriff didn't answer. Instead, he slammed on the brakes, stopping the car at the entrance to the grove. Unfastening his holster, he pulled his revolver free. What's that going to do? There's hundreds, maybe even thousands of them. It's not for them. The sheriff leveled the gun at Roger. Now, get out. But you can't, he contested. They'll kill me. You're a cop. You're supposed to uphold the law. I am. And the law I'm upholding is much higher than the one represented by this badge. Now, I don't know what you did up there or whether you deserve this or not, but I have a whole town to think about, not just you. So get. Mouth agape, Roger opened the door and stepped out of the car. Please. The sheriff frowned. I'm sorry. Really, I am. Now then, just in case you try running back to town, he pulled the trigger. The bullet ripped through Roger's knee, knocking him to the ground. Jesus, he cried. Once again, I'm sorry. Pulling the door shut, the sheriff put the car in reverse and backed out of sight. Bathed in the fading luminance of the car's headlights, Roger wept. With the car gone, the demons scuttled out of their hiding spots. Their eyes glowing yellow, their vicious mouths frothy with saliva, they encircled him. What are you waiting for? Finish it! Roger pounded his chest in frustration. But the orange men and pumpkin men hesitated. Growling, snorting, they paced anxiously as if waiting for some sign. Hello, Roger. The voice, eerie and hollow, came from behind him. Roger turned. It was Carla. You can't escape me, lover. We're bound. The minute you buried me in the special ground, your fate was sealed. Carla, I'm so sorry. Please believe me, Roger said between heavy sobs. He surprised himself by how genuine, how truthful his words were. I know you are, she soothed. Carla seemed to glide effortlessly over the stony ground as she came to his side. What do you want from me? He cowered meekly, like a frightened mouse. Are you going to kill me? I want you back, lover. I want you to love me. Lowering her sinewy hand, she gently stroked his cheek. Her flesh was smooth and slick. I don't understand, he said, looking up. Her sex, bare and slightly parted, dripped with yellow nectar. Roger caught a drop on his tongue. It was as sweet as honey. Please, she beckoned. Around them, the army prowled impatiently. They were obviously not pleased by their master's overtures. Roger stared up at his living dead bride. Despite being composed of vegetable matter, she looked breathtakingly beautiful in the moonlight. But what about them? He asked as he motioned toward the predators. What will they do? I don't care. He smiled as he reached up to her. Well, if you gotta go. Stooping, Carla lifted him effortlessly into her arms. Cradling Roger like a child, she lowered her face to his. What the hell, Roger thought as he opened his mouth and accepted her kiss. Her breath was warm and scented of baked pumpkin. Carrying her man, Carla retreated back to the grove. A bloodthirsty, furious horde followed closely behind.